Welcome to this panel. This is panel C. It's the second parallel session, and our topic today is tracking in families and schools. And my name is Anders Albrechtslund, and I will chair this session. So if you're not here to hear about children or childhood or schools, then it's not the right room. Yes, we will have 3 presentations this morning. The first one will be presented by Maja Sonne-Damkjær from Aarhus University. It's called Negotiating Family Tracking. And after that, Ask Risum Bøge, also from Aarhus University, will present a paper called Performing Privacy in School. And finally, we have Professor William Staples from the University of Kansas, and as guest professor at the moment at Aarhus University, who will present a paper called It Was the Bible of High School, Real-Time Gradebooks and the Quantified Student. And just from a practical point of view, practicalities, we will start with the 3 presentations. We will have 20 minutes each for these, and then we will have a session of questions afterwards. So we will have just about 25 minutes for a good discussion about this topic. So I think we should just get started. Are you ready, Maja? And actually, I'm a co-presenter of this paper as well. So I'm actually also starting with some preliminary information about this presentation and the next presentation, because these 2 first presentations originate from the same research project, which I'm heading together with my colleague Peter Lauritsen, who's unfortunately not here today. And this project is called Childhood Intimacy and Surveillance Practices. And I will just briefly introduce the general project, and then Maja and Ask will go into more details. And the central research question that we are working on is this: how are surveillance and tracking technologies used in intimate contexts of life? So what we are interested in general is why and how these technologies are used in families, how they are negotiated, and how they potentially transform relations between children and parents, teachers and among students, and so on. And the reason why we are interested in this topic is because surveillance in this sphere of intimacy is a rather widespread and rapidly growing topic and phenomenon. And at the same time, these practices in intimate relations offer a new perspective on surveillance in general, and which is something that we most often think about in more public or social spheres: CCTV, mass surveillance, big data, and so on. So our ambition is, of course, to explore how these technologies are used in relation to children and childhood, but also we want to contribute to a larger discussion of surveillance, and think that this topic can offer a special perspective on that, and the general deep infiltration of technologies in our contemporary life. Yes, so with those words, I will give the floor to Maja.
Okay. Thank you, Anders. Good morning. My name is Maja Sonne-Damkjær. I'm a new postdoc in this project that Anders is talking about, the Childhood Intimacy and Surveillance Practices project. And I defended my own PhD just a month ago. So I've been working on this project for around 4 months now. And today I'll present some of the early findings that we have from Negotiating Family Tracking project. So, just to give you a short outline of what I'll be talking about today, I'll shortly present the project's aim and research questions, the theoretical perspective that we're working with right now, and inspired by, I'll shortly say something about what it means to work within this family context, at least for us, and what implications it's got on our method and the way that we approach these questions in general. Then I'll say a bit about our method and research design before I point to some of our preliminary findings in this project. So, first of all, it's important, of course, to say, what is this really about? Why and how are tracking technologies used in families? So that's our overall goal to find out. But we're not just interested in what we might call uses and gratifications. We're also interested in how these technologies are potentially changing the relationships in the families, for example, between parents and children, but also the overall dynamics within the family. And also, we are interested in other types of practices that are related to these different types of what we might call surveillance or tracking practices, because it's not always obvious, at least to the families, that this might be something that researchers would call tracking that's going on in their lives. So, we are interested more broadly in how parents and children are engaged in tracking, care, and governance of the selves, and how these practices are embedded in cultural notions of life quality. So it's also very much related to life quality in the families as such. And also, how are these tracking practices negotiated in different ways by the families themselves, by parents, by children? That's our overall goal to study. So, we are departing in surveillance studies, new notions of surveillance. So, what we might call perspectives that are more interested in what's been called horizontal surveillance, the complex, not always hierarchical and not always systematic monitoring practices, for example. The practices that are ritualized, relational, reciprocal, might be playful also and related to, for example, self-realization and everyday communication. And we have seen, lately we've seen new concepts emerging, for example, participatory surveillance, to cover some of these types of technology and media use, social surveillance by Marwick, for example, and interveillance also as a concept that's been trying to kind of conceptualize these types of surveillance and tracking practices within the everyday life context. So, where do we depart? We are inspired by different types of theoretical perspectives, but also different studies that's been conducted earlier. For example, science and technology studies, of course, as we'll say more about that. But also, we're also inspired by audience studies, as audience studies got a tradition of researching the role of media, both digital and also electronic media within the family context. Also, domestication theory offers different perspectives to understand, for example, the moral economy of the family in relation to the moral economies in society as such, as ways to understand how people approach and how they negotiate and how they adopt different types of digital media and technologies within their family life. And then also mediatization theory offers different perspectives that proves to be quite relevant, as they're also interested in how the interrelation between media and communication changes are related to social and cultural changes, and how these different types of interrelations might affect both relationships, cultural practices, and the ways that different institutions work. So let's say a bit about the family. The family context is, of course, a very interesting place to research these new types of tracking and intimacy related digital media uses. Because the family context, especially when we look at families with children, they're usually early adopters and also usually very keen adopters of new technologies. We know that from a long branch of research. And we also know that the appropriation of digital media within the family context is influenced by the social cultural context that it's taking place in, but also the different types of lifestyles that's present within the specific family, and also parenting style. So it's coupled within different types of norms and values that might guide the way that parents and families use different types of media and the practices that they give meaning to, so to speak, and also how this institution overall will function and work and be affected by the way that the new technologies are appropriated. If we look at the family institution, that's interesting, of course, and this relationship between parents and children, because from a traditional point of view, we already have a hierarchical relation, because traditionally it's parents that rules and governs the resources in the family. So that's, of course, important. But on the other hand, we see a lot of late modern trends in family life that might, in different ways, erode some of these formerly very hierarchical relationships. For example, we are talking about a democratization of family life, that we become more equal in the family. We have an intimization of family life. We are not in the family because we need each other just to provide for food or the more practicalities of family life. But we are seeing that families are closely knit together with different types of communication practices, for example. And then on the other hand, children's lives are becoming more and more institutionalized, so the care might take place in other places. So relating and negotiating relationships are very much related to how we use different types of technologies, also for communication purposes. Then on the other hand, we see other types of trends, for example, intensive parenting, helicopter parenting, all types of parenting that's put forward as something which might be very much about surveillance, paying attention, trying to enhance the child's possibilities in different ways in relation to health and learning and such. And on this basis, we've been working with this project and also been working with the method and the research design. So we are very exploratory, grounded, and use a qualitative social phenomenological perspective in our way of approaching this context. And our departure's really also been to discuss and try to find out how can we study tracking practices within family life. We quickly discovered that this is not as easy or straightforward as it sounds when we sit and write our proposals, because when families or parents, they hear things or notions of tracking or surveillance, they might not recognize themselves. So this is not perhaps what we think we're doing. So they might talk about different aspects that might be related to surveillance, but they don't conceive as such as something that in their minds is surveillance. So what we've been doing is that we have not been looking at surveillance practices or technologies as such, but what's the role of digital media and technologies in the social and cultural context of the family in a more broad sense. And then we address the issues of surveillance analytically. And we do that by exploring a range of practices, relations, and interactions that are related to the use of digital media in the family. And for now, we've done qualitative semi-structured interviews with Danish parents, 3 individual interviews with mothers, and 2 couple interviews where both the mother and the father were present. And these families are in different phases. Some were first-time parents expecting a new child. Some of them had preschool children, a bit older school children, and some of them had teenagers. And the interview themes that we've been working with are the use of technologies to coordinate family life, everyday life. How do the families stay connected in different ways? How do the partners in the family, might not always be the biological mom and dad, it might sometimes be families that are brought together in different ways, new types of families, but also how are the parent-child relationship supported? Also, how do they produce, store, curate, and share photos and information related to family life? And how do they use social media in relation to family life, both parents and of course children when it's relevant also? And how do they use technologies in relation to practices of care and control in different ways? For example, monitoring or tracking their children. Then we've also been interested in and talking with the parents about the motives for and their attitudes towards the use of different types of digital media and technologies in relation to family life and parenting. So both their attitudes toward their children's use of digital media and technologies, but of course also their own practices. And what we might define as their accounts of the media or the accounts of the technologies, which is both about how they use these technologies, but also how they talk about the use of these technologies and the options they're given with these different types of technologies. So some of the parents have not been using tracking technologies themselves, but then they have been talking very much about whether they wanted to do it or whether they didn't want to do it, whether it was an option for them in their family life or not. So the first analytical steps that we've been taking has been to try to see some of the patterns that are within the material, both within the specific family structures and the different family life phases. And the material that we've got for now is primarily from highly educated parents. So we'll see if we can get some with different types of educational background in the second round of interviews that we'll be doing. But now I'll shortly elaborate on some of our preliminary findings. So what we found was that these negotiations that took place about family tracking, they are very much entangled in broader negotiations of the role of the use of technologies in the family and in parenting practices as such. They're deeply embedded in what we might call, with domestication theory, the moral economy of the household, but also parents' own norms and expectations as respectively mothers or fathers, and also their motivations, value judgments, and beliefs. And they're inspired both by dominant parenting ideals and practices, but also their own childhood memories and imaginary. And therefore we can say that we see actually some of the perspectives that for example, some of the new studies, US studies, have been showing that the overall ethics that guide parents' negotiations are, in relation to these boundaries of trust and intimacy, are very much connected to different types of ethics. So, for example, nurturing self-development and empowerment as one goal and one angle, and or reinforcing respectful connectedness and family ties. And that's something that Lynn Schofield-Clark has been pointing to as something that's very much what's going on in American families. But we also see some of these tendencies here. Then we also see what we might term as tales of trust. The parents talk very much about trust as something that's a quality in itself. Of course, they have very different interpretations of trust, but it is something that's very important culture-wise. So trust is a key word, both in relation to pro and con monitoring of their children and tracking. And also freedom versus control, that's related to negotiations about being visible or being invisible. How is that negotiated? Also seeing and being seen. Who's going to see me when, and what's okay to see? Being reachable or being out of reach, which are also very much pointed to as something they were preoccupied with. And then many of them talked about imaginaries of their own childhood. So having the freedom to roam, for example, versus being on a digital leash. So some of the parents would point to that the freedom to roam would be supported by digital media, for example, tracking on the one hand. And other parents would say they would never do that. It was something that they would absolutely not go for as such, because it went against their ideas of trust and trusting the child, and the child being someone who could manage their own freedom. So we see both strategies of resistance and strategies of different types of modifications in the ways that the families approach these different types of tracking possibilities. And some of the ambiguities that we see in the parents' accounts of both what they're doing and also the moral values that's behind these attitudes is that we see, for example, putting analog versus digital surveillance as something that one thing is the good thing and the other thing is the bad thing. So analog as being positive and related to care, whereas digital is negative and related to control. So this is not what's in all the families, but this is at least one angle on approaching these different possibilities. Because other parents, they use tracking technologies as communication. So these tracking technologies are used in some ways to supplement or substitute coordination communication. For example, texting, where are you? When are you coming back? When are you coming home? So these constant geotag visibility in some ways substitutes perhaps time-consuming everyday calls and text updates. At least that was the way that some of the parents talked about this, more as communication. And that, of course, also had to do with whether the parents were negotiating this family tracking as something that we all do as a family. We are all visible, what we might call horizontal visibility practices, whether they engaged in that, where all family members can see each other's whereabouts, or whether they engaged in vertical visibility practices, or what we might call tracking and surveillance, where parents can track of their children's whereabouts, or while the children can see where their parents are, or the children are not aware of it. So, where do we go from here? Right now, we are still doing interviews. We have several interviews lined up that we're going to do within the next couple of months. So we're interested in, of course, also some of the perspectives that are closely related or anchored in also the different educational backgrounds or sociocultural backgrounds that the parents might come from. We also want to do different types of workshops where participants can use test equipment to see how do they approach and how do they adopt these different technologies within their everyday family life. And then, of course, we're going to do further systematical, in-depth analysis of the empirical material.
My name is Asger Bøge. I'm a postdoc at the Center for Surveillance Studies as well as Maya. And I'll do a presentation about how children perform privacy on behalf of my colleagues Anders Lund, Lars Bo Andersen, and Peter Lauritsen, and of course myself. As you may have noticed, the title of the presentation has changed a bit. This is due to the fact that we're not finished with collecting and analyzing our material on school children, and we choose instead to present an analysis of children who are placed in foster care. So we're still talking about school children, but not specifically the types of interviews that we're doing at the moment. So we're drawing on a project which Lars has conducted along with Peter Lauritsen and myself. So in the case, we explore how a new communications platform between placed children and their case managers at the municipality leads to more conversations, more trust between the two parties, and ultimately more knowledge. However, but by establishing a more intimate connection between government and children, you also open up questions about privacy. What to do with privacy? In a society where practices of surveillance and tracking are increasingly pervasive, we are pressed to ask questions about what privacy is and how to understand privacy in everyday life. In public debates, many argue that privacy is important and use privacy to criticize the spread of surveillance technologies. However, there is little consensus about what privacy is or how it should be weighed against other concerns. In addition, others are arguing that privacy is already dead or rapidly diminishing. Common for both ways of addressing privacy is that privacy seems to represent fixed spaces, types of information, or decisions. In this perspective, privacy is not something that can ever grow, but will always diminish or stay the same when new technologies offer extended ways of communication or when government seeks intimate knowledge about its citizens. Of particular interest to us, privacy is debated in our field of surveillance studies. Among others, John Gilliam has argued that privacy is hyper-individualistic, spatial, legalistic, blind to discrimination, and simply too narrow to catch the richness of the surveillance experience. On the other hand, Colin Bennett and others try to defend privacy. Bennett has pointed out that privacy will not disappear, and although privacy is difficult to define and varies between cultures and legal systems, privacy frames political debates, is practiced every day by lawyers and institutions, and is still the most effective way of dealing with imbalances of power. In our project, we are trying to address questions of privacy. We do so because privacy keeps emerging as important to our actors, and because we think that much can be gained by studying privacy in situated practices. Our work is both empirical and theoretical. Our empirical focus is on children. Specifically, we focus at the moment on interviewing ordinary Danish school children in 8th to 10th grade. However, in this presentation, as I said, we focus on children placed in foster families and institutions, so they're still school children. To us, children are interesting for privacy discussions because they live in a privacy gray zone where they, to some extent, are allowed to have a private life by adults until they come of age. In addition, children are interesting because their voices are rarely heard in privacy discussions, and because we believe that adults play important and dynamic roles in helping children deal with their private lives and become autonomous. These privacy concerns are accentuated with placed children, as they do not only have to suffer their snooping parents at home, but also their case managers who need intimate knowledge about their lives in order to make decisions about, for instance, where they should live, if they should visit their biological parents, what school to attend, etc. A basic premise for our theoretical work is that grand statements about the essence and value of privacy are bracketed. Instead, we understand privacy as something that is performed and delimited in and by specific relations. This entails a shift away from the fixed notions of privacy as something someone has or something, and towards something where privacy is an event. What we aim to do in our work is not to define privacy, nor do we want to apply privacy concerns in order to critique people or institutions who transgress the boundaries of private life. Instead, we are aiming to develop an analytical sensitivity for understanding how privacy is practiced in everyday life, and to illustrate how it may be used in empirical analysis of Danish children. The sensitizing notion that we suggest is performing privacy. This is our attempt to approach the complexity of the ways that privacy arises as a matter of concern and is practiced, negotiated and constructed by heterogeneous and distributed actors. The implications of this term, which are drawn from science and technology studies, are that privacy is not simply tied to an individual, but always located between actors. Privacy is a product of complex social interaction and no longer means that simply just to be left alone. Second, these participating actors are not just people or laws. Technologies play interesting roles in these privacy negotiations. They do not simply undermine or enhance privacy, but transform what is private and what is not, and how this is communicated. Third, privacy is not fixed and already in place, but is something that emerges as a matter of concern and is defined and done in practice. While our ideas are drawn from STS, they align with newer developments in privacy analysis. For instance, Helen Nissenbaum emphasizes the importance of the context in which information is disclosed. In addition, Elise Marwick and Dana Boyd have tried to develop a model of network privacy in which the context of information sharing is determined through a combination of audience, technical means, and social norms. In the following analysis, we look at children placed in foster families and institutions, and a research and development project called Teledialogue. The aim of Teledialogue was to create a closer connection between placed children and their case managers at the municipality. This was done by supplementing the rare and difficult face-to-face talks with video conferencing and chatting through Skype for Business. The project on placed children was motivated by the understanding that social workers felt that they failed their obligation to track the welfare of the placed children. The face-to-face meetings they had with the children were rare, and the data they had from government databases and talks with foster parents were insufficient to making the important decisions. The placed children were also eager for having closer contacts. The children expressed frustration that they did not know their case managers well enough, that they were unable to contact them when they needed help, and that they did not feel included in their own cases. As it was important to the children that this link was invisible to others in their social circles, Facebook and other such channels were dismissed. Instead, Skype for Business was used because personal connections are invisible, because it offers chat and video conferencing, and because it, in contrast to regular Skype, lives up to the Danish Data Protection Agency's standards for municipal communications. Finally, children who did not have smartphones or computers or iPads were provided with iPads by the research project for the testing phase. 6 municipalities, 28 case managers, and 25 children 10 to 17 years old help to design and develop the concept of teledialogue through workshops, test runs, and experiments. In addition, semi-structured interviews and participant observations have been conducted with children, case managers, foster parents, pedagogues, and IT professionals. In general, our interviews show that Skype for Business has become an important addition to the children's relationship with their case managers. Increased contact led to more relaxed conversations, increased trust and knowledge. However, it also became evident that matters of privacy arose in different ways throughout. How privacy questions arose and how they were performed depended on 3 relations in particular, which will now be elaborated. As mentioned, a basic condition of the relation between case managers and placed children is that their conversations would often involve private content, as it was important for case managers to know more about the children than what was measured by the schools and reported by teachers, pedagogues, foster parents, etc. In these conversations, how privacy was performed clearly depended on the relation between the placed child and the case manager. Sometimes the children didn't trust the case managers with the information and would try to keep it to themselves, even though they were pressured by the case manager to disclose it. At other times, the children would ask their case managers for help with matters that concerned them, such as pushing back against pressures from divorced parents or convincing foster parents about something. The children would thus voluntarily provide the case manager with private details on their relationships with significant others. In such cases, the case managers became the children's allies rather than their adversaries. Yet the case managers would sometimes feel that they got too close to the children and would reflect on maintaining the right balance between interfering in children's private lives and being at a professional distance. Either way, privacy arose in some capacity in these conversations, and boundaries between private and public were performed and negotiated. Importantly, these boundaries are not necessarily stable. Some days the children were simply not prepared to have the difficult conversations. They would be sad or tired or shy. Some children have diagnoses which affect what they are able to do on certain days. Finally, the children could not always trust that they would have the same case manager forever, as they would change jobs and leave the cases to someone else. This was often devastating to the children who had built close ties and trust with their case manager. In one case, a placed child refused to accept the new case manager and formed closer ties with her father, which the new case manager found troublesome. In contrast to the regular face-to-face meetings between placed children and case managers, the supplementing meetings are mediated by technologies which participate in how privacy is performed. Video conferencing through Skype for Business is different from face-to-face meetings because of the lack of eye contact, the ability to escape the conversation, and the ability to control what the other party sees. The lack of eye contact stems from the slight difference in the position of the screens and the webcams on all devices. This is described by respondents as an invisible wall, which diminishes the intensity of the contact between the participants and paradoxically allow for more private matters to be discussed. Furthermore, the ability to control what the other party sees by turning or shutting down the camera and continue through chatting is important. Children would do this in order to avoid that the case manager saw them while they were upset, had hangovers, etc., but the conversations would continue. Finally, the context of the conversations and the implicated actors mattered greatly. For instance, the foster parents would demand that the conversations with the case manager were held in the living room so they could stay informed about what was said. Biological parents would try to coach the children in what to say and what not to say to achieve certain goals, and girlfriends and boyfriends would suggest to the children that their relationship was not discussed or disclosed, fearing that the caseworker would intervene in their quote-unquote bad relationship. In one case, which illustrates both context and implicated actors, an extremely jealous boyfriend worked to keep one of the placed children we interviewed from talking to her case manager. He argued that their private affairs was not to be invaded by some case manager, whom he feared would work to break up the couple. The girl, however, wanted the contact and thus suggested that she and the case manager could talk while she was waiting for the bus stop, at the bus stop, sometime during school or at a cafe. Such private talks were not a problem for the girl. However, the case manager could not agree to this because of the privacy of others could be violated and that it was her responsibility to avoid that from happening. In the end, neither the place girl, the boyfriend, or the case manager had privacy to themselves as their own, but were forced to negotiate in relation to one another, and in relation to some specific context. In conclusion, privacy is obviously important to these children, and boundaries between private and public is constantly performed and negotiated. In our material, we see that the relation between the case managers and the children, the technologies, the context, and other implicated actors matter in how privacy is performed and how we have provided these preliminary parameters as a starting place for understanding privacy in practice. However, it is difficult to determine in advance how privacy would be performed in the next encounter. So what to do with privacy? Obviously, we cannot throw the concept away, but how can we put ourselves in a situation where we as social researchers can understand what is going on? We believe that this question is important, as privacy is at stake in many of the topics that are discussed on surveillance and tracking, as well as in research with children. Thank you.
I'm going to talk a little bit about the context of this work, briefly related to issues of surveillance. Seems to be the theme that we're talking about here today. So surveillance, in a most general sense, refers to the act of keeping a close watch on people, scrutinizing or monitoring their behavior, right? I wrote a book called Everyday Surveillance, and it focuses on the kinds of work that's been talked about already today, the non-state-driven, big brother-ish kind of notions about surveillance, and that I've been working on for more than 25 years at this point. In the book, I use this term called tiny brothers, to talk about these local knowledge gathering kinds of activities that seem to be appearing. Again, it was kind of my when I started looking at this work in the early 1990s, what was going on, it clearly was not a big brother I saw happening, but all these other kinds of technologies that were emerging. And I define them as often enhanced by new information, visual communication, and medical technologies, okay? That they're the driving force to some extent behind them, although there's lots of interests, and I'll talk about that momentarily. Tiny brothers are typically embedded into the routine activities of daily life and are often adopted in the interest of security, governance, efficiencies, and commerce. I found an appropriate sign there for the local context. Nearly all these kinds of what I call also data sponges collect quantified measurements regarding an individual's movements, behaviors, and activities, okay? So we can think of all these different gadgets that this entire conference is kind of built around, right? They're used by both public and private organizations, and the purpose of these strategies is often to influence choices, change habits, keep people in line. I use that notion of just simply a kind of word for social control, monitor performance, and gather knowledge or evidence. Okay. How they're often produce what I call different forms of information asymmetry. Right, so an organization that collects information about somebody's whereabouts or what have you produces a set of measurements, various kinds of information that's used to leverage the behavior of someone else, right? So there's an imbalance in the information. In a Foucauldian sense, the tiny brothers are technologies of power, right, which aspire to shape conduct and produce desired effects and avert undesirable ones. So this is the kind of more of the social control aspect of surveillance and these technologies and techniques that my work has tended to focus on. But tiny brothers may also encourage participatory monitoring. Corbett and Marks wrote a piece a number of years ago about participatory monitoring, and Anders has work on that as well. So individuals may use the information collected about them to improve their own behavior or performance, right? So we can think of examples of this in which, is it social control, or is it's this way of trying to get folks that are subject to these kinds of techniques to, in a sense, deploy them on themselves, right? To use them to effect. And this would be sort of, in a sense, the ultimate goal, right? In the way that folks would adopt them. And you can think of workplace tracking. In my book, I talk about various kinds of workplace tracking activities in which workers are encouraged to use the very tracking devices. For example, they could be built in to them where they earn more money if they use the device in certain ways, right? So they're incentivizing workers. Drug testing. I've done interviews in the context of house arrest with folks, and there's this referring to using drug tests to keep myself clean, right? So you use the technology to monitor yourself. And house arrest devices, similarly, in interviews I did with people living under house arrest, they talk about the technologies of house arrest as keeping them, using them in essence to keep themselves being good, essentially, right? So in this context, that's the setting of this broader context. But I've done a study in the US about these things called student information systems. And this really dovetails well with the work of my colleagues here. These are web-based, data-rich, I call them. They provide real-time access by students and parents to teachers' grade books and attendance records. And administrators have access to class rosters, student demographic data, families, siblings with multiple families, multiple step-parents. They know all the folks that are in these families. There's behavior and disciplinary notes in the system. There's rubrics and grade scales, immunization and health records, address management tied to Google Maps. One administrator was telling me about how they immediately click on this thing and bring up Google Maps. They can do Street View to show the house in which the children live in. It's pretty amazing. So there's a company called PowerSchool Technologies, which is now owned by Thomson Reuters. I think they've been bought out several different times, but this is one of the big players. There's maybe 75 to 80 private technology companies that sell these systems to school districts in the US. They are in virtually every decently sized school district in the US, and there is not a single piece of academic research on them. I was just stunned when I first started doing this work, right? So this is how PowerSchool Technologies describes their system. A performance infrastructure that enables students, parents, teachers, and administrators to work together to improve student achievement. Online access to schedules, grades, homework, and attendance information makes it easy for parents and teachers to stay in close contact with student progress. Parent access allows them to get involved in their children's progress on a regular basis. Students take responsibility for their own learning. So here's this kind of responsibilization process in which they're encouraging students to do this. In another paper that I've done, which is more on the kind of social control surveillance side of this, is that this creates this network of surveillance in which you have a situation where if the teachers don't post the grades soon enough, the parents will call the vice principal, the principal of the school, complain that the teacher hasn't posted the grades, and then the principal gets a hold of the teacher and tells them to post the grade. So it's this network of accountability in which people are all linked in this way. So my theory, I put that in quotes because I'm still, this is very preliminary. The SIS is a communication infrastructure that encourages this multi-directional surveillance and accountability. That's that first part. But it also kind of mobilizes and shapes the self-governing capacities of students to bring their own ways of conducting and evaluating themselves into alignment with the goals of the school and parents, and reinforces their self-identification as high-performing learners, okay? So today I'm focusing on the other sort of side of this, in which this system encourages this self-governing capacity of the students, right? So my general finding so far is that students engage in intensified self-tracking of performance metrics. For example, class grades, overall grade point average, the number of advanced placement courses. These are courses, I don't know whether you have something like this here, where they're pre-college courses that, and students take, if they take more and more of them, it's sort of high status. So when they transfer to college, these courses go with them. And something one of the students talked about in a school district called NHIs, not handed in assignments, they keep track of those, and standardized test scores. These students obsessively monitor these metrics through smartphones and other digital devices, frequently comparing their performance metrics with other students, and often generating a lot of anxiety for themselves, okay? So participant narratives suggest that these systems intensify surveillance of student behavior and performance and foster what I would call micro-level assessments of their everyday lives by parents, teachers, administrators, but also by themselves. So in essence, they've kind of turned the panopticon on themselves. They've internalized the gaze of these systems and their parents and the school, right? I was trying to graphic this, and I don't know if this makes any sense whatsoever, but there it is. So the study design, I conducted semi-structured interviews with a convenient sample of recent high school graduates, parents, teachers, and administrators. There's 32 interviews total, about half hour, but they ran, a lot of them ran longer than that. The goal was to derive accounts of how SIS, these student information systems, actually operates, understand the unique perspective of each stakeholder, and how they experience and make sense of the SIS. So these are the four groups that I interviewed, but I'm only going to show some evidence from the students today. So I'm going to run through some example quotes here. It's kind of hard to show qualitative data in these kind of settings, but be patient, and I'll kind of read along, and I've highlighted some of the things that I think are important relative to this topic of this conference. My mom wasn't exactly using her part of the account. In other words, the mother wasn't checking on the students' grades, mostly because she trusted me. You know, trust is a huge thing here. Me enough to know that I was checking my own grades. I was doing my own work. I was turning in everything, which I'm really proud of myself for. There was an app for mobile phones so students could check their grades. So as soon as they get quizzes, tests, and essays back, they check. Everyone whipped out their phones to make sure it was on Student View. That's the student portal. And that's why they implemented a program called Bring Your Own Device. This is in the school. And they made a special Wi-Fi because they knew once this program was there, kids would want to check it. Yeah, it was the Bible of high school. Okay. I took out some of these. Young people in the United States use like all the time. It drives me crazy. Like, you check it by the hour, and it becomes this instant feedback loop. You're like, I turned it in, is it in? I turned it in, is it on Student View? And it's just this constant like, yay, it's in there. Oh God, I had a bad grade. Oh, it's in there. Oh, I didn't turn it in. It's just this constant feedback loop. We're panicking and then satisfaction and then panic, then satisfaction, then panic, and it doesn't end until you graduate. We were a high-strung group, right? I said, high-strung? Yeah, and I was definitely part of that, mostly because you're kind of sucked into a world of checking your grades by the second, because you never know that your first period teacher, it's seventh period, maybe they put up the grades. In some rooms, the Wi-Fi wasn't strong, so I would I know it's my 4th hour, it doesn't get good signal, so I'm going to bring my laptop because today I have 4th period, which means I bring my laptop so I can check my grades. Right, so I say I'm envisioning this scene where somebody says chemistry grades are posted and whatever, and like you said, and oh my, especially after midterms or finals, when the teacher would say it's all on student view now, and everyone's like, and then there's a frenzy over it because everyone would want to, because it also calculates your final grade, including curves. Students don't have to wait for teachers to manually calculate things with curves. So the second your grades were posted, that was it. Kids wanted to see their grades before their parents, so they just could have an explanation ready just in case. A lot of the kids talked about this, a lot of the parents talked about this negotiation about the implications of what their grade would be and how it might affect them in terms of their family life, right? The system would show whether or not you turned in assignments, so parents would also see whether or not you missed a quiz, what grade you got on the quiz, whether or not, how many not handed ins, these things. It's like I wrote a little poem. I log into Student View and then I cry because I see letters in NHI. It's the truth. When you see those letters NHI, you just break down because you know everyone sees it. The administrators can see it, the teachers see it, the parents see it. Everyone knows that you didn't turn that in. My mom saw me at the kitchen table for hours because I was taking all AP classes because I thought I was the smartest. But but when there's something like Student View, everyone who looks at you is like, I see that you're not turning in your work. It's just a constant reminder that you're not doing what you're supposed to be doing, and that you're not living up to the standards your teachers have for you. Sometimes there's disappointment or just resentment, or teachers will be like, oh, you're not living up to your potential, and then parents just get upset. I know you can do better than this. I know you're a smart kid, right? So you hear a lot of this kind of self-definitions in this about who am I relative to these adults around me and teachers and others. I said, was there competition among students? Oh yeah, Student View also showed your GPA for all 4 years, your weighted GPA, and if you had AP classes, you could show it. There was proof that you took so many such and such AP classes. Yes, it just created a culture of, are you above a 4.0 or are you below a 4.0? If you take AP courses, you can actually get above a perfect 4.0. So these kids are all the way over on the chart. Because there was certainly a note of arrogance for certain kids, me being one of them. So it's a status thing, especially when we got into the testing period and of our lives, SATs, ACTs, and others. The Student View was certainly a facilitator. This is a female frequent user. I didn't mention those things. You can see them. Our school provided us with a MacBook Air. She was in a private school. So everybody would just pull out their laptops and check their grades. So you'd walk into class and see laptops open and someone says, chemistry grades are posted. And then everybody gets on and starts checking. Yep, Staples, are you there? Was there a lot of comparing? Oh yeah, lots of that. People were like, how did you do? And then you're trying to turn your computer so people don't see if you got a bad grade. And if you did good, you're like, look how good I did. And so my school, everybody competed with each other. So it was always, oh, you have a B+, I have an A-, and it's like I'm one step ahead of you. So it also helped us compete with each other in a sense. And this kid says, yeah, I have this grade in this class, but no way I'm calculating what you could get on the final. I could raise it, and what's the point? But then, so what I was asking about how they use it as a way of kind of manipulating their grades, like focusing their energies in certain areas and not others, again, sort of this calculation, right? I like being able to always check my grades and always be on top of things. Okay, let's talk about it, let's figure it out. Oh, so she's talking about going to teachers and being in this active, this kind of active student, right? I'm going to move along here because I'm going to run out of time. Why did I skip that one? Okay, here's a mail. It was pretty much only like a reference thing, and if you really wanted to keep track of my grades specifically, because I didn't want them to give me a quiz back and say you've got to be in this class now. So I check online. Near finals week, added up what points I needed to get X grade. So again, the calculation is going on, and get immediate feedback. If you didn't have a certain GPA, you had mandatory study hours unless you were in an honor society and a certain GPA to get in. You had the first period blocked out for studying. So I would check it, make sure I had good grades. If not, get on top of them, get them better, make sure I wasn't falling behind. Yes, let me, I have too many here. Yeah, this last one is pretty good. She talks about this one young woman. I had a love-hate relationship with PowerSchool. I feel that what was doing was a good grade because I received some sort of satisfaction from making good grades. But I think at the same time, it's sort of like equating yourself to that. Like when I get my first B in high school ever, like it kind of brought me down, and then I had to work to realize that it's not a bad grade, that a B is okay. It's not like the end of the world, right? And she goes through this whole thing about trying to live with being less than an A. So my conclusions. Preliminary analysis suggests that the SIS creates a detailed, quantified portrait of students' lives that can be drawn upon for various reasons and assessments. Some parents rely on the SIS to establish the truth about their children's performance and monitor it closely. Other parents who trust their children rarely use it, given that their high-performing kids use it obsessively and have internalized the gaze of the school and parents' expectations. The last group of students that I've focused on here appears to display these self-governing capacities outlined by Nicholas Rose with regard to neoliberal governmentality. I'm not suggesting this is about neo, but it's these notions that he has in there. Those being enterprise, or the rules of conduct in one's everyday existence that include energy, initiative, ambition, calculation, personal responsibility, and autonomy, right? And I think these quotes illustrate both of these things nicely, in which these kids have adopted this. Both of these qualities are a product and reinforce this metric culture of the school, as well as the quantified selves and performance-based identities of these students. So I'll stop there. This was supported by the Spencer Foundation. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much to the presenters, and we do have some time for questions now. Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Really interesting presentations. I have a question directly for William, but I think it relates also to the previous two papers. And I'm not sure if you're aware, but some people have been doing some research in apps like Class Dojo and platforms like FitnessGram in schools. And I know that both, I'm not American, but I know that both those apps and software are used extensively in American schools. In fact, nearly all primary schools in America use Class Dojo. And I don't know if you know Class Dojo, but it is a behaviour management app that's used by teachers, where they record details about students' behaviour and then send them to the parents for their review, but students can also view the teachers' comments on their behaviour. So it's very much a surveillance technique for managing classroom behaviour, but it's also moving into aspects like mindfulness now, so encouraging teachers and students and parents to all engage in this sort of interesting combination of surveillance. Well, it's a combination of surveillance of students and behaviour management also, but encouraging responsibilisation on the part of the child to be a mindful, to calm. It's about emotion control as well. So it's a really interesting phenomenon, and it's actually being brought into I'm not sure in terms of continental European countries, but it's British schools are now adopting it, and in Australia now too. So I just signed up to it for my own daughter the other day and thought, But another app that's used quite a lot in Australia is Seesaw, and I'm not sure if people are aware of that app as well, but it's a way that teachers use to send notifications to parents about there might be images of their child in class and photos of the child's work. So again, it's not as quantified. These two apps are not as quantified, but they're very much about constructing the surveillance around parents, teachers and children. And there's some interesting work being done by Ben Williamson in Scotland. He's written quite a bit about these apps and also about how Pearson, for example, is coming into the whole classroom environment in terms of software, and also, of course, Google has got a huge range of software now, Google Classroom. And so there's a lot of interesting implications there about the commercialisation and commodification of tracking of students. So anyway, just to throw those things out there that you all might find quite interesting, because they're all about sort of family surveillance, child surveillance, and implicating schools within those networks as well.
Right. Thank you. I wasn't aware of that, and it sounds typical the way we're moving in terms of schools. You mentioned Google. There was 2 pieces in the New York Times last week. One about Google's now raced ahead in terms of dominance in classrooms. And secondly, there's this move with Silicon Valley types to rescue the American school system, and those folks are the ones who immediately want to use every kind of digital device, et cetera. And there's a lot of big players in it, big corporate players. Pearson owned PowerSchool Technologies, and they sold them, I think, to Thomson Reuters. But thank you.
A lot of really important implications there about how big companies are profiting from these kinds of surveillance of children in the context of schools. And my own research with teachers in Australian schools shows to me that they've got no idea. I think, oh, great, this is a great technology, and it seems like a really good and interesting, exciting technology to use, but teachers themselves aren't thinking through the privacy and commercialisation issues.
Thank you for your comment. It reminds me that I recently read a book of Tonya Rooney and Emmeline Taylor, of the editors. I think you did a piece there as well, a chapter.
Ben Williamson's also got a chapter in there
he's
as
also
well.
there. Yeah. And I was just amazed about how spread out these types of technologies are in a US context, for instance. While we haven't found it in a Danish context. We have, of course, some sort of school systems where you can see grades and so on, and parents and teachers can communicate and such things, but nothing of the sort that are described in this book or in this presentation by Bill. So, thank you.
I should just mention too, there's a special issue that just came out in New Media and Society on children's rights in the digital age. I'm not sure if you've seen that special issue, and again, Ben and I have got a piece in that, but I'm not trying to push my own barrow here, but there's lots of other interesting articles in it.
Thank you so much for your comments. I just wanted to briefly say something about some of the apps that we actually do have for example, in Danish schools. We have an app for called Parent Intra, where the parents can, of course, communicate with the teachers, but also with each other. So some of the new research that's been there was a PhD that came out, I think, last year, was about actually how not children were surveilled, but more like the surveillance between parents as a consequence of these new technologies, that they could definitely all the time, because of these new, very visual ways of also showing your engagement and your involvement as a parent. That was an issue, especially with less advantaged families. So there's been a bit of research in that area in Denmark, but that's more or less it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I think we have a question from Christian Ulrik Andersen.
Yeah, you talk about this sort of moral economy that's related to childhood, and there's a moral economy you talk about, particularly in relation to sort of the adults and other humans, if I understand you correctly. But I was thinking that in a digital childhood, whether there are other morals too. In your talk, Bill, you talked about the sort of grammars of actions that are implied by this sort of software used in the educational system, this sort of neoliberal governmentality that we subject our children to, that have its own kinds of rhetorics and procedures and protocols that deeply affect the children, as also exemplified in the quotes. So I'm wondering, the role of this for parents. How do the parents that you talk to perceive this, and if they don't consider it a problem, how to interpret this lack of awareness? I mean, it can easily be extended to other subjects too, where you could say that there is or isn't an awareness, sort of that the tools that we parents use are often social media, and in social media there's a particular sort of client-server consumerism at stake. Is that something that concerns us as parents? And if not, how to interpret this lack? I could think of numerous examples where the sort of where we address the moral, not of parenting, but of the technologies.
Okay. Well, yes, I think one of the main differences in the angles might be that we've been talking to parents what they, of course, voluntarily use and how they perceive the uses, but also been talking to parents that didn't use these different types of technologies and why they wouldn't use it. So we would approach them with some of the same questions, but some of them were definitely non-users, at least in the beginning. So they would say, no, we will never do that. And we would, for example, present different types of situations that might come up. So and they would talk about, for example, when your child will walk home on his own, would you support him with a phone, for example? Did you use baby monitors with video, for example? And a lot of the parents, or at least the findings that we have, are also from parents that did resist different types of these different types of technologies in different ways. So that's at least that's one aspect. But I think in general, what we see is not very much a concern about the commercial side. That's not come up very often, at least in the material that we've collected so far. But concern about privacy, for example, and being, for example, a parent, also a digital parent, in relation, for example, to pay attention to the privacy of the child, for example, related to sharing information and photos in social media, for example. But for many of the parents, they would also emphasize that these different technologies were not always used in ways that they perceived as related to tracking or surveillance. So, for example, one of the examples that the whole family used, I think, Find My Friends, an app where you can see where different members of your family or friends are, would say, well, we use it instead of communicating. So we'll only use it just to check when he will be back home. So it was kind of very different, the ways that they would approach and the practices that they were relating to using these technologies. So I think that's also very interesting in the way that they perceive these options or new ways of communicating. So it's also a part of everyday family communication. So at least that's one part of it. So I think that we also need to pay attention to the meaning-making processes that they are part of, these technologies. Of course, we also have to look out for more critical perspectives and questions when we address this area, of course. But yeah, that was just briefly.
Yeah, I found in my work that the moral dimensions are they're overseeded by the sort of practical dimensions often, and even parents that were ambivalent about them found themselves adopting them because it's sort of like the influence of other parents too. One thing that the system that I was looking at does is log every time a parent uses the system. So I've started to play with this notion of what a definition of a good parent is, and a good parent uses the system. And so if one decides on kind of moral reasons not to use the system, they're pressured or potentially could be told by a teacher, well, Emily failed this, this test, didn't you look on your thing? Right? So there's this sort of shifting. It's all very fluid. I also found some parents would say some of the same kind of objections, and then they would use it for one of their kids, and not the other, because they had this. You see what I'm saying? So they had this notion that one of their children needed this sort of additional surveillance, and another one didn't because they performed at whatever acceptable level. So it's all this kind of mix of negotiation over the practicalities, but also maybe some kind of moral economy of the technology. I mean, some parents I talked to are really resistant to the whole thing, and they didn't want to use it. So.
Can I say something?
Yes, go ahead, Lars.
Okay. Thank you, Christian. Just one short comment. The other day, Ask and I made another presentation about this upcoming theme in Denmark called data-driven welfare, which may be the next big thing. Hopefully not, but maybe. And I think, because we talked a lot about governmentality and Foucault here, and there's a nice paragraph at the end of Discipline and Punish saying that behind the calm surface, you should always hear the roar of battle. And there's something about this data-driven welfare that is really good for this, because we had two cases. One is the national school tests. Another case is data in social work. And in both cases, this collection of data and analysis of data is being maybe not resented, but kind of like welfare professionals have very ambivalent feelings about it. And so too does parents, and so too does children. So it is this kind of data production that is from the outset being a controversy. And honestly, I think a lot of teachers and social workers would rather have it go away. So they're telling the parents, we'll do this because we have to, and then we'll see and try to make the best of it. So I think this kind of big data or data-driven governmentality will be very interesting to follow, at least in a Scandinavian context, because it will make visible the kind of like the battle of, Short comment.
Any other questions? Well, maybe you have you presenters have questions for each other. I don't know. Comments. Oh, that's yeah.
Should I just talk? I think everyone can hear, right? I mean, at least. Thank you. At least one of the issues I think happens in Denmark vis-a-vis standardized testing is the time that it takes. I think in the States you have the same thing, right? I mean, a lot of the motivation for opt-out movement is sort of, well, it takes so much time. And I think sort of like the school information systems that you talked about, I mean, the data that goes into them are just, old-fashioned stuff, right? Standardized testing, registrations, the kind of data that, at least in the American context, has been around for a long time. I think, might there be, some kind of displacement in this agenda once the data you put into them is something that you can just register from the computer? I mean, if more and more teaching goes on in learning systems, well, maybe we don't need to spend time on registering the students who are there, who aren't there, and registering how they did, because it will all happen automatically. And I think that might change a lot of those debates, because, well, we don't spend class time testing anymore. The teacher won't have to spend time logging down all kind of information, which is at least part of the controversy, that they don't want to do that. I think that's an interesting sort of potential where the politics of it will change once you don't have to waste your time doing the work. It'll just happen automatically, but won't change all the Foucauldian stuff, right? I mean, that'll still happen. I think that's interesting.
Very short before I give it to Bill. Actually, I would just say that I'm not sure about the national tests, but at least in social work, actually the burden of producing data is growing with the number of IT systems being put in place. So the automatization kind of like goes the wrong way. And this would be one of the major battles that the welfare professionals, of course, feel alienated because they are increasingly becoming data producers. And especially because the thing that kind of like sets data-driven welfare apart from statistics is that it needs to be kind of effect-oriented. So it needs to measure effects before, under, and after. So it's this kind of like automatic, evidence-based social work, which takes a lot of work to produce, and when these data are produced, they're very low quality, basically. So the work goes up. So I think that's one interesting point, that IT systems kind of like fail to deliver on the promise of automatic data.
Yeah, no, I agree. We see that at the higher education level. We're sold these systems that are supposed to, you can do somebody's promotion in tenure case with the press of a button. So some sales guy said that in a context of trying to sell my university a whole system, and you know, of course, it's a nightmare. It doesn't work at all. So yeah, I mean, there might be some of that automated processes ultimately going on as more and more of the pedagogy ends up on the system. So it's both kind of the Foucauldian nightmare of it, though, is that, and even with these systems that they have now, with successive generations, they're putting these in place from the time kids are very, very young. And those files follow them all the way through. So I talked to administrators who would say they looked at those behavioral files that she's talking about all the way back when the kid was in, you know, grammar school, and they get flagged and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. So yeah, it's kind of frightening to me.
Well, thank you very much. I think we've reached the end of this session. Thank you very much for all your questions, and thank you very much to the presenters for your presentations.